In example 3a, we see a different kind of series. This is the series from Baird's Violin Concerto. Here we go. Well, this is interesting. This one is much easier to remember for the simple reason that it's one simple pattern, ascending thirds, which make up triads or seventh chords, as you prefer, ending with a little bit of whole tone scale. Although you might not remember every single note, the pattern is very easy to remember. And in fact, in the piece, it allows them to use triads as part of this serial piece. So it makes the whole thing more familiar and generally just simpler. Okay? So this is one way you can make a series more audible. Make the series consist of a much smaller kind of pattern that's easy to perceive. Example 3b is another example of a series that's fairly easy to grasp. Okay? It's done differently, but it's the same principle. Let's listen to 3b. Well, if we look at this, if you look at the brackets above it, you see that this is really the same little three-note group 4 times. First time, minor second, major third, then major third, minor second, then major third, minor second, major third. So this is really as though we had a 3-note series. It's presented on different pitches, but the result is the whole thing is not really a pattern of 12 notes, it's a 3-note pattern, and it's quite audible. There's a certain kind of harmonic simplicity about that that makes it fairly easy to grasp, and that's the point. Okay? Again, this kind of series makes it much easier to make the music have some kind of audible coherence because the series itself has a certain simplicity about it. Now let's look at example 4. Here we go. You recognize it? Well, it's actually example 1 backwards, that is to say retrograde and transposed. I moved a few notes up or down an octave. Now these are really standard things to do with the series. I'm not doing anything at all exotic here, but the point is, you've heard example 1 several times now. I don't know about you, but I would never ever have guessed the connection between them, listening to those examples. Now let's look a little bit at chords derived from this series. The chords in example 5 are derived from the series in example 1a. Here are the chords in example 5. And again, that comes from okay, so the chords are pretty varied. Okay, here are the chords in example 6, which is related to example 2. The series of example 2 was the more diatonic one. And here are the chords. And finally, example 7 is chords derived from the Baird Concerto series, example 3a. Again, let's just remind ourselves of the series. Here are the chords. That's the only one so far where you can actually really hear something of a resemblance between the chords in the series. And there's another problem. Series are all about order. In other words, you can't just do the notes in any old order. What does order mean within a chord when you hear all the notes at the same time? Order doesn't necessarily mean from top to bottom or bottom to top. Just all it tells you is you're going to use, let's say, 5 notes of the series in a 5-note chord, but where you put them in the chord is up to you. Well, that's very nice, but what the connection is with the series is often not at all obvious. Not to mention the fact that chords can be spaced and orchestrated in any number of ways, so it's a pretty important question whether you really can make an audible association or not at all. So as you can see, the big problem with serial harmony is making it perceptible. So what can we do to make a series easier to perceive? Well, one thing you can do is you can use just half of it at a time. Say 6 notes, it's called a hexachord, for a while, and then the other half. 6 notes at least begins to be something that people can remember. Another thing you can do is you can repeat a bunch of notes like a motive. Repeat 2 or 3 notes from the series and just do them several times before going on, so the listener has a chance to sort of focus on it. You could also use just part of the series in a melody and the rest in the accompaniment. All these techniques, in effect, break down the series into smaller, more memorable chunks. Let's look at example 8b. Example 8b is based on the series in 8a. I'll just play you the series now. Now listen to it again, having had the series freshly in your ear. You notice that in this example, what I've done is I've broken up the series into little parts. We have the first part, 4 notes, repeated 3 times. Then the second part, repeated twice. Then I go back to the first part, then the second part, and finally I move on. So before moving on to new notes, you hear quite a lot of repetition of the same 3 or 4 notes. In addition, the left hand has the same notes in a chord. And finally, new notes that we repeat it again. And then by breaking up the series in little pieces like that, I've put it into motives that people will remember. The motives are small enough, just 3 or 4 note motives, that now I can make sense of this series. In a sense, I'm teaching it to the listener by using all that repetition, by breaking it up and using all that repetition. Also notice at the end, since the last 2 notes of the series are D flat and E, I've repeated the D flat 3 bars, bars 11, 12, and 13. And I've saved the E for the end. In other words, I sort of dramatized that last note. All this, again, is to make you really notice the pattern of the series. If I play the series in whole notes, or if I just take away those motives, it's not memorable at all. It becomes memorable because of the way the context organizes those notes. Example 8c is based on the same series, just organized differently. The top line has more or less the complete series in a melody, except a little bit's repeated. The top line is, then the next bar goes a little farther. So I have little bits of repetition between bars, okay? And then the left hand here, the left hand is actually taking just a little chord from the series, okay? It's just taking, it's a major third plus a major second, and all the chords in the left hand are different spacings of a major third and a major second, which also comes from the series. Let's listen to 8c. So again, here the texture is divided up in 8c. We hear something melodic on top, which has some repetition. And underneath it, we hear the same chord repeated several times. I mean the same chord, not in the sense that the same pitches, but the same intervals. It's like I'm using a tiny little mini-series underneath of 3 notes. And because those 3 notes are easy to remember, it gives a definite harmonic character. Last point I want to make about serial technique is that classical serial technique often excluded doubling at the octave. That was partly because they wanted it to be atonal, and octaves easily create tonal anchoring. But in fact, there's nothing intrinsic about serial technique that says that you can't use octaves. In fact, it is possible to use them, and there are actually good reasons to use it. One of them being, just in terms of acoustics and orchestration, it helps avoid grayness to double in octaves. Also, even in terms of harmony, like in the first bar of 8b, it helps give you a certain solidity to those repetitions. In other words, octaves are an acoustic fact, so why not use them when appropriate? As we can see, serial technique can give interesting results if the composer pays attention to using it in a way that's audibly coherent. But that's the composer's job. It doesn't happen by itself. In general, coherence is the result of limiting the material in a way that the listener can grasp the patterns. And you need to reinforce those patterns that you want the listener to notice with all aspects of the music. Again, if I took example 8a without the repeated motives, let's say big variations of rhythm and timbre, there's nothing particularly compelling about it, and we certainly wouldn't hear the series. Again, just using a series by itself in no way guarantees audible coherence or musical quality. Speaking for myself, personally, when I write my own harmony, I have a strong preference for certain kinds of sound. And one of the things that annoys me about serial harmony is sometimes is forcing me to use a note other than the one my ear is asking for. So that's one reason personally I don't tend to use series, at least not in this sort of systematic way.